Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to the dusty banks of the Tigris River, right across from modern-day Mosul. It's the winter of 1849, and the air is sharp and cold. A determined Englishman named Austin Henry Layard is swinging his pickaxe into an ancient mound called Kuyunjik. The usual crunch of clay and debris suddenly gives way to a jarring, solid clang. His tool has struck something immense, something man-made. He's just found the corner of a palace that belonged to the Assyrian king, Sennacherib. Right now, he has no idea that his discovery is about to blow humanity's understanding of its own past wide open. Working alongside local laborers in conditions that would make even the most hardened archaeologist today think twice, Layard methodically uncovers room after room of this ancient palace. The winter months provide a brutal kind of relief, a respite from the scorching heat that makes summer digs impossible, but they bring their own nightmare of thick-sucking mud and the constant threat of flooding from the nearby river. As his team carefully brushes away centuries of accumulated dirt, they start to uncover thousands of clay tablets. Many are broken into fragments, all covered in the intricate wedge-shaped marks of cuneiform, a script scholars were only just beginning to decipher. The scale of the find is staggering. It becomes clear this isn't just a random collection of artifacts. This is the library of Ashurbanipal, assembled in the 7th century BC. Think of it, one of the world's first attempts to gather all human knowledge in one place, a vast repository of everything from administrative records to what we're here to talk about, absolute literary masterpieces. Now extracting these tablets required nerves of steel. Many had been baked hard and preserved by the very fires that destroyed the palace when it was sacked. Others were crushed by falling masonry or cracked under the weight of history itself. Each one had to be meticulously cleaned, cataloged, and prepared for the long, precarious journey to the British Museum in London. By the time Layard wrapped up in 1851, he'd recovered approximately 30,000 tablets and fragments. That's a literary treasure trove that represents the accumulated wisdom of millennia of Mesopotamian civilization. And tucked away among these thousands of tablets was one particular set that would eventually captivate the world, though its significance wouldn't be recognized for over 2 decades. Enter George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum. This guy's background was unconventional. He was a former banknote engraver whose eye for minute detail became invaluable as he pieced together fragments and decoded the complex script. Then on a December day in 1872, Smith is working through a collection when he reads a passage that makes him stop dead. It describes a great flood, a righteous man who built a boat to save his family and animals, and the sending of birds to find dry land. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah were unmistakable, but this version was clearly centuries older than any known Hebrew text. Contemporary accounts say Smith was so overcome with excitement, he began to undress right there in the museum. A reaction that, while maybe a bit exaggerated in the telling, perfectly captures the earth-shattering significance of the moment. He was reading part of what would become known as the Epic of Gilgamesh, specifically the part containing the flood story. This discovery proved that stories considered uniquely Hebrew had much earlier Mesopotamian roots. It was a revelation that fundamentally altered our understanding of ancient literature and the Bible itself. The world this epic was born into was one of staggering achievement and brutal reality, a place where humanity was literally inventing civilization itself. Forget everything you know about the ancient world for a second. Picture this during the Early Dynastic Period, around 2900. BC, Mesopotamia wasn't just a collection of villages. It was witnessing the rise of the world's first true cities, and the city most synonymous with Gilgamesh, Uruk, was an absolute marvel. We're talking ancient engineering on a scale that would be impressive even today. Archaeological evidence suggests that, at its absolute peak, Uruk's massive walls may have housed as many as 50,000 people. Let that number sink in. In an era when most of the world was still nomadic or living in small settlements, Uruk was a sprawling, teeming metropolis, one of the largest human concentrations on the planet. To a modern time traveler, the physical appearance of these early Mesopotamian cities would have been both awe-inspiring and utterly alien. You'd first see those monumental mud brick walls, often 30 feet high and just as thick, encircling the entire urban core. These weren't just for defense. They were the ultimate symbol of civic pride and power, visible for miles across the dead, flat alluvial plain. Within those walls, a maze of narrow, winding streets snaked between tightly packed houses, workshops, buzzing with artisans, and the ever-present smell of baking bread smoke and humanity. Towering over it all was the most prominent feature of any Mesopotamian city, the ziggurat. This was a stepped pyramid temple, a literal mountain made by man reaching for the heavens. Built entirely of sun-dried mud brick and waterproofed with bitumen, these structures required constant maintenance under the harsh Mesopotamian sun, but they served as the beating heart of the city, both a religious center and a constant reminder of the community's shared identity. The society that produced the earliest versions of the Gilgamesh stories was deeply and rigidly stratified. At the very top stood the Lugal, the big man, the king. This wasn't just a political role. He was the military leader and the high priest, the intermediary between the people and the gods. Below him was a class of nobles and priests, the elite, who managed the temple estates and the complex bureaucracy. Then came the merchants, the artisans, and the farmers who formed the backbone of the economy. And at the very bottom of the social ladder were the slaves, often prisoners of war, or citizens who had fallen into debt slavery. This entire social structure is mirrored perfectly in the epic itself, where Gilgamesh's divine parentage and his exalted status as king are hammered home throughout the narrative. He is from the very beginning set apart, but what fueled this incredible urban experiment? What kept 50,000 people alive in one spot? The answer is agriculture, specifically the cultivation of barley and wheat in the unbelievably fertile soil deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This was the economic foundation. But this agricultural abundance didn't just happen. It required a level of social organization we still find impressive. Sophisticated irrigation systems, networks of canals, dikes, and reservoirs had to be constantly maintained and managed to prevent both drought and catastrophic flooding. The epic is obsessed with this delicate balance, frequently referencing the life-giving properties of rivers right alongside the terrifying destructive power of floods. Their entire world, their very survival, hinged on controlling water. And looming over every aspect of this life was religion. The worldview of early dynastic Mesopotamia was polytheistic and deeply concerned with the fragile, often fraught relationship between humans and the gods. The pantheon was a divine bureaucracy. At its head was Anu, the sky god, the distant CEO of the universe. Then came Enlil, the god of wind, and storms, the tough operations manager. And then Ea, later called Enki, the clever god of wisdom, and fresh water, the master engineer. Each city had its own patron deity. Uruk was dedicated to Anu, and later to the goddess Inanna Ishtar. The epic reflects this complex religious landscape in its portrayal of various gods and their very direct, very personal interactions with mortals. The gods were not abstract concepts. They were unpredictable forces of nature that had to be appeased, honored, and feared. This was the real, gritty, awe-inspiring world that a historical king Gilgamesh would have actually ruled over. a world of mud brick and divinity, of grain and gods, where the first epic story was about to be born. Centuries after a historical king Gilgamesh might have walked the walls of Uruk, his story began its most profound transformation. We now enter the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BC. The political landscape of Mesopotamia has been completely redrawn since the Early Dynastic era. The Akkadian Empire has risen and spectacularly fallen, and now various Amorite dynasties are controlling different city-states. The most famous of these, the dynasty of Hammurabi in Babylon, the guy who created that first comprehensive legal code we all read about in school. This was an era of consolidation, of codification, not just of laws, but of culture, of knowledge, of literature. And it's in this environment that the individual standalone Sumerian poems about Bilgames, the Sumerian name for Gilgamesh, get their first major upgrade. This was the era of increased literacy and the establishment of idubas, scribal schools, attached to temples and palaces. These weren't just classrooms. They were the tech hubs of the ancient world, training the administrative personnel needed to run these increasingly complex urban societies. Imagine a young scribe sitting cross-legged on the floor, his stylus in hand, carefully copying classical texts on a wet clay tablet. His curriculum, administrative documents, religious hymns, and crucially, the stories of Gilgamesh. This educational system was the engine of cultural preservation. It ensured these narratives were transmitted across generations with remarkable fidelity, even as the world around them kept changing. But these scribes were far more than just human photocopiers. They were active interpreters, editors, and authors in their own right. Think of them as the ancient equivalent of a writer's room for a major TV series. They took the earlier, disconnected Sumerian stories, Gilgamesh's conflict with Aga of Kish, his journey to the cedar forest, his relationship with Enkidu, his quest for immortality, and they started weaving them together. They added new episodes, created narrative connections, and fleshed out themes, transforming a series of individual tales into a coherent, sprawling epic narrative. This process wasn't the work of a single genius. It was gradual, involving multiple generations of scribes, each one adding their own layer to the evolving tradition. The true masterpiece, what scholars call the Standard Babylonian Version, is traditionally credited to a scholar priest named Sinleki-Unini around the 7th century BC. Now this guy is a somewhat mysterious figure. What we know about him comes from later references and scribal signatures on tablets. He appears to have been attached to the temple of Nabu, the god of writing and wisdom in Babylon. His work was the definitive edit. He didn't just copy earlier versions. He crafted a unified narrative structure, a carefully planned arc that would become the version we strive to reassemble today. His achievement was nothing short of remarkable. He took these disparate building blocks and constructed a profound exploration of human nature, mortality, and the tension between civilization and the wild. He developed the character relationships, especially the deep bond between Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and added psychological depth that makes the epic feel startlingly modern. This standard version was organized into 11 tablets each, containing about 300 lines of verse. The structure is brilliantly planned. The first tablet introduces us to Gilgamesh and his city. The middle tablets follow his adventures with Enkidu, and the final ones focus on his desperate, heartbreaking confrontation with mortality after his friend's death. It creates a perfect dramatic arc, moving from youthful arrogance and adventure to the hard-won, weary wisdom of experience. The literary techniques employed are sophisticated and incredibly influential. The epic makes extensive use of parallel structure, repeating phrases or ideas with slight variations. This technique, common in oral poetry, creates rhythm and emphasis, and made the text easier to memorize for the scribes who preserved it. But it also employs complex metaphors and symbolic imagery that would echo through later literary traditions across the ancient Near East. This was the work of a master editor, a literary architect who understood the power of story, not just to entertain, but to ask the biggest questions a person can face. The standard Babylonian version of the epic doesn't open with a celebration of King Gilgamesh's divine power or his glorious city. It opens with a complaint, a stark, brutal portrayal of a despot who has pushed his people to the absolute breaking point. After the lofty prologue, we are immediately thrust into the streets of Uruk, not as a place of wonder, but as a kingdom groaning under the weight of its ruler's insatiable ego. The text describes a king who has undergone a horrifying transformation from protector to oppressor. He uses his divine heritage and royal prerogatives not to shepherd his people, but to justify their systematic degradation. This is a portrait of absolute power, corrupting absolutely, a theme so timeless, it sends a chill down your spine, even now. Gilgamesh's oppression wasn't random. It was a meticulous exploitation that infected every single aspect of his subjects' lives. His most infamous abuse was the appropriation of the right of jus primae noctis, the right to sleep with new brides before their husbands could. Now, while this practice shows up in the myths and laws of various ancient societies, in the context of the epic, it's presented as a fundamental, horrifying violation. It wasn't about desire. It was about domination. It demonstrated his complete disregard for the most intimate sacred bonds that held families and communities together. He transformed what should have been the most joyous occasions, weddings, into sources of deep humiliation, rage, and collective trauma. The sexual exploitation extended beyond this single rite, suggesting a broader pattern of predatory behavior, where no woman, regardless of her status or family connections, was truly safe from the king's whims. This created an atmosphere of pure fear that permeated every level of society. Fathers were powerless to protect their daughters. Husbands couldn't defend their wives. The traditional structures of honor and protection that allow a community to function simply crumbled under the weight of royal tyranny. But his abuse didn't stop there. It extended ruthlessly into the economic sphere. Those massive construction projects that made Uruk famous, the walls, the ziggurats, the palaces, required an enormous human cost. Gilgamesh's approach to mobilizing this labor showed a complete disregard for his subjects' welfare or the very rhythms of life that sustained them. The epic describes how he would conscript young men for these projects without any regard for agricultural seasons or family obligations. Imagine it fields of grain, ready for harvest, left to rot, because the men who should be reaping them are forced to haul mud bricks for a royal monument. This isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. It creates food shortages that ripple through the entire population, causing hunger and destabilizing the very economy that funds his ambitions. He was literally sacrificing the city's future for his own glory. And then there were the military dimensions of his tyranny. Yes, his conquests expanded Uruk's territory and brought wealth into the city, but they came at a horrific price. The king's appetite for warfare seemed endless, driving him to launch campaign after campaign that served his personal glory more than the city's genuine security needs. Young men were conscripted for these adventures with no consideration for their family's survival, creating a demographic crisis as casualties mounted. The most productive members of society were being lost to unnecessary conflicts, leaving behind broken families and crippled farms. This wasn't leadership. It was a form of societal suicide driven by one man's unquenchable thirst for validation. The epic's portrayal is a masterclass in understanding how tyranny operates. It's not just about the big dramatic acts of violence. It's the slow, systematic grind that touches everything: your family, your livelihood, your sense of safety, your very future. Gilgamesh used his position to extract maximum benefit for himself, while externalizing all the costs onto the population. The divine parentage that should have made him a benevolent protector instead became his justification for treating mortals as expendable resources for his personal satisfaction. The people of Uruk, who had once celebrated their king's strength, now lived in constant anxiety. The traditional bonds of loyalty between ruler and subject had been severed, replaced by a seething, silent resentment. They weren't citizens anymore. They were hostages in their own city, viewing the king not as a hero, but as an enemy whose very existence threatened their basic human dignity. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because honestly, living under a ruler like that, with no recourse and no hope, you probably wouldn't survive this. But the people of Uruk were about to try a desperate final gambit. They decided to take their complaint directly to the top management, the gods. The people of Uruk were utterly broken. They had endured in silence for as long as they could, hoping their king's behavior would moderate or that some natural force would intervene. But as the abuse continued and intensified, their desperation reached a fever pitch. They had exhausted every earthly remedy. There was no court to appeal to, no council to overrule the king. Justice was impossible when the king himself was the primary source of injustice. So they did the only thing left to them. They turned their faces to the heavens and cried out for supernatural assistance. But these weren't simple prayers for personal relief. This was a formal theological challenge to Gilgamesh's very right to rule. Their pleas were directed at the highest authority in the cosmos, Anu, the supreme sky god and king of the Mesopotamian pantheon. As the divine king, Anu was considered the ultimate source of all legitimate authority on earth. The people's appeal to him was a calculated move, arguing that Gilgamesh's behavior had violated the divine mandate that justified royal rule in the first place. They weren't just whining about a bad king. They were arguing that his tyranny represented a cosmic crisis, a tear in the fabric of order that required direct divine intervention to repair. This transformed their suffering from a political grievance into a matter of universal significance. But they didn't stop there. Parallel prayers were sent to Uruk, the goddess of creation. This was a brilliant, nuanced understanding of the crisis. Uruk was the one who had originally shaped humanity from clay. Their appeal to her emphasized how Gilgamesh's behavior wasn't just a political problem, it was a perversion of creation itself. His tyranny threatened the very essence of human dignity and social order that made civilized life possible. Their prayers asked her not just for relief from oppression, but for active intervention to restore the sacred balance between ruler and ruled. The epic's description of these prayers reveals an incredibly sophisticated theological framework. The people understood that divine intervention wasn't automatic. It required the proper ritual approach and a compelling, well-argued justification. Their prayers were meticulously crafted. They emphasized not their personal suffering, but the broader threat Gilgamesh posed to the divine order itself. They argued that allowing such a king to continue unchecked would ultimately undermine the god's own authority and the cosmic principles they represented. It was a masterstroke. They were essentially saying, "Your honor, if you let this stand, it makes you look weak." The divine response to these prayers is where the epic reveals its complex understanding of how the gods interact with human affairs. The Council of Gods didn't simply zap Gilgamesh with a lightning bolt for his crimes. Their solution was far more creative, far more sophisticated. They chose to address the underlying problem rather than just punishing the symptom. They decided to create a counterpart, a mirror image who would transform the tyrant king rather than simply destroy him. This reflects the epic's ultimate concern with redemption growth and balance rather than mere retribution. The task fell to Uruk. Her role in creating Enkidu carried deep symbolic weight. As the goddess who had originally sculpted humanity from clay, her decision to fashion a new being, specifically to counter Gilgamesh's excesses, represented a kind of divine correction, a software patch for her earlier work. The epic even suggests the gods recognize their own responsibility in the crisis. After all, Gilgamesh's divine parentage had directly contributed to his sense of superiority and isolation from ordinary mortals. The process of Enkidu's creation, as described, involved divine artistry of the highest order. Uruk didn't just mold a human form. She designed a being with specific qualities to match and redirect Gilgamesh's excessive energies. She made him equal to the king in strength and courage, but fundamentally different in character and values. Where Gilgamesh represented the pinnacle of civilized achievement, corrupted by power and isolation, Enkidu would embody natural virtue, uncorrupted by social hierarchy or political ambition. He was designed to be the king's equal, but also his opposite. His clay was gathered from the pristine wilderness, moistened with water from wild springs that had never been touched by human irrigation systems. Every element of his creation emphasized his connection to the natural world and his separation from the urban environment that had produced Gilgamesh's moral decay. The gods' solution was elegant. Instead of removing the problem, they would provide a cure. They would give the tyrant a friend. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because trying to argue your case before a pantheon of unpredictable, easily offended gods, you probably wouldn't survive this. But for the people of Uruk, it was their only hope. And out in the silent, untouched steppe, a new form of life was about to take its first breath. Out in the untouched, windswept steppe far beyond the irrigated fields and the shadow of Uruk's walls, something unprecedented was happening. The goddess Uruk, hearing the desperate prayers of the people, went to work. This wasn't a typical act of creation. It was a divine correction. She gathered clay, not from a riverbank tended by farmers, but from the pristine wilderness soil that had never been turned by a plow or claimed by a king. She moistened it, not with canal water, but with the pure wild essence of springs that bubbled up from deep within the earth, completely untouched by human hands or ambition. Every element was chosen to be the absolute antithesis of the civilized world that had produced Gilgamesh. She wasn't just making a man, she was crafting a mirror, a living counter-argument to tyranny. What emerged from her hands was a being of raw natural power. Enkidu's body was massive, every muscle hardened not in a gymnasium, but by the constant brutal exertion of survival in a harsh environment. His frame was built on a scale that matched Gilgamesh's own divine heritage, but it was a strength achieved through natural development, not supernatural endowment. Uruk gave him physical capabilities that allowed him to thrive where any civilized human would perish. His senses were preternaturally sharp. He could track a gazelle across vast distances, detect the approach of a predator by the slightest shift in the wind, and navigate by environmental cues invisible to city dwellers. His reflexes were lightning his endurance, beyond that of even the hardiest nomadic peoples. His appearance was a testament to his wild origins. His hair grew long and thick, a matted mane that protected him from the scorching sun and the freezing nights. His beard was wild and untamed, unlike the carefully oiled and curled beards of the men in Uruk, giving him a fierce, commanding aspect. His skin was darkened and toughened by constant exposure, etched with the scars and calluses of a life lived entirely outdoors. The clothing Uruk provided for him was made entirely of animal skins, but not the tanned and decorated pelts of hunters. These were raw, roughly fashioned coverings from animals that had died natural deaths, allowing him to move silently and remain undetected among the creatures he was destined to protect. Enkidu's existence in the wilderness was a perfect, harmonious symbiosis. He wasn't just a man living among animals. He was a part of the ecosystem. His knowledge didn't come from scrolls or teachers, but from direct intuitive observation. He could read the subtle signs of changing weather, find water in landscapes that appeared completely barren, and predict the seasonal migration routes of animal herds. His relationship with the wild animals transcended the normal boundaries between species. They didn't fear him. Gazelles would graze peacefully near him. Wild cattle would allow him to approach their calves. Even predators like lions and wolves accepted his presence without a hint of hostility. They recognized a kindred spirit, a guardian, and a guardian is exactly what he became. His primary role was that of a protector. When drought struck the steppe, he would guide herds to hidden water sources only he knew. During harsh winters, he led them to sheltered valleys where they could find forage and survive. But his most significant duty involved intervening in human hunting activities. The wilderness where he lived was regularly visited by hunting parties from outlying settlements. While hunting was necessary for survival, the methods often horrified Enkidu. He saw the cruelty of snares and traps that caused prolonged suffering, and the waste of hunters killing more than they could use, leaving carcasses to rot. So, he acted. With a combination of brute strength and incredible stealth, he became a saboteur. He would systematically locate trap lines, freeing captured animals and dismantling the devices. His knowledge of animal behavior allowed him to warn herds of approaching hunters, causing them to scatter or hide. If hunters tried to drive animals into a killing zone, Enkidu would create diversions to allow their escape. He moved through the wilderness like a ghost, breaking apart the most sophisticated snares with his powerful hands, calming frightened creatures and guiding them to safety. When direct confrontation was necessary, his sheer physical presence was usually enough to convince hunters to abandon their efforts without violence. He was the wilderness's immune response, and for the hunters whose livelihoods began to mysteriously vanish, he was becoming a very real problem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because trying to make a living when a supernatural wilderness guardian is systematically destroying your traps and scaring off your game, you probably wouldn't survive this. And for one particular hunter, the crisis was about to come to a head. The mysterious wilderness guardian was no longer just a nuisance. He was an economic catastrophe. For hunters like the man we'll call Shamhat, the situation had become desperate. His family had worked these territories for generations, but now his traps were systematically destroyed, his hunting grounds eerily empty of game. His livelihood was evaporating. The pressure on his household had reached a breaking point, threatening not just his income, but his entire way of life. Before giving up the profession that had sustained his ancestors for centuries, he decided on one final, desperate gambit. He wouldn't just set more traps. He would find the source of the problem and confront it directly. Shamhat assembled a small party of his most experienced and courageous fellow hunters. This wasn't a typical hunting expedition. It was a reconnaissance mission with the goal of capture. They equipped themselves with nets and ropes, hoping to take this elusive saboteur alive to understand his motives and hopefully negotiate an end to his disruptive activities. For weeks, they combed the wilderness, a frustrating exercise in tracking a ghost. They followed every disturbed trap site, questioned nomadic herders who might have glimpsed a large wild figure, and found nothing but more frustration. But their persistence finally paid off. They discovered a pattern in the destruction, a radius of activity that suggested the saboteur was operating from a base camp near a particular cluster of natural springs. They had finally narrowed the search to a manageable area. The first sighting occurred at dawn, with a morning mist providing perfect cover for observation. From concealed positions, they watched as a massive figure emerged from a rocky shelter. The various descriptions they'd heard from other hunters didn't do him justice. His enormous frame moved with a surprising silent grace. They watched stunned as he checked on nearby animal herds, the creatures showing no fear of him whatsoever. This confirmation that they had found their target was also a moment of sheer intimidation. Their initial plan to capture him by stealth and numbers suddenly seemed naive and utterly inadequate. The confrontation was brief and decisive. Enkidu became aware of their surveillance, his heightened senses detecting them despite their careful concealment. But his reaction wasn't fear or flight. It was a calm, assessing curiosity. He turned the tables on them, approaching their position with deliberate steps, making no attempt to conceal himself. The hunters found themselves being studied by their intended prey, a reversal that left them frozen and uncertain. His massive frame and wild appearance created an intimidating presence that made several of the hunters immediately reconsider their entire involvement in this expedition. When Enkidu spoke, his voice carried the calm authority of someone completely confident in his ability to handle the situation. His communication revealed both his intelligence and his fundamental disconnection from human society. He understood their language perfectly, but was genuinely puzzled by their motivations. He asked why they needed to kill animals when the wilderness provided abundant plant foods. The hunters' explanations about economic necessity, leather for clothing bones, for tools, and meat for trade. The very foundations of their civilization made little impression on him. These concepts held no relevance in his world of immediate survival and natural balance. A tense negotiation began highlighting the absolute incompatibility of their worldviews. Enkidu, trying to be helpful, offered to teach them methods of wilderness survival that would reduce their dependence on hunting. The hunters, while impressed by his obvious knowledge, explained that their communities required animal products for purposes far beyond mere survival. It was a deadlock. Seeing this, Shamhat proposed a radically different approach. Rather than trying to force this wild man to stop his activities, why not introduce him to human civilization? Perhaps, if he understood the complex web of needs and relationships that defined their society, he might moderate his behavior. The proposal intrigued Enkidu. His curiosity about the human world had been growing during his years of isolation, fueled by these brief, confusing encounters. The invitation to visit Uruk represented a crucial turning point. The decision to leave his wilderness home was not made lightly. It meant abandoning the animals he had protected and the environment where he had found purpose. But his growing sense of isolation and a deep innate desire to understand these strange, clever creatures ultimately convinced him. He accepted the invitation, setting in motion a journey that would transform not only his own existence, but the fate of a king and his entire city. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from, and what time it is for you. Because leaving everything you've ever known to walk into a world you can't possibly understand, you probably wouldn't survive this. But Enkidu was about to take that first fateful step. The journey to Uruk was a crash course in a world Enkidu could never have imagined. Every step away from the silent open steppe was a step into a landscape increasingly modified by human hands. The transition was jarring. He saw fields of cultivated grain monocultures of barley and wheat stretching across landscapes that had once supported diverse communities of wild plants. He saw irrigation canals, stark geometric lines cutting through the earth, channeling water that had once flowed freely to support natural ecosystems. This systematic organization of space, with its clearly defined boundaries and specialized functions, contrasted sharply with the organic interconnected patterns of wilderness life he understood. It was efficient, but to his eyes, it was also strangely sterile. His physical appearance and behavior marked him as an utter outsider in every small agricultural settlement they passed through. His wild matted hair and primitive clothing, made of raw pelts, drew stares and whispers from settled peoples who had never seen anyone living in such a primordial state. Simple everyday activities we take for granted became profound challenges. Eating prepared food bread beer stew was a bizarre experience for a system accustomed to raw plants and meat. Sleeping in an enclosed space under a roof felt suffocating compared to the endless canopy of stars. His unfamiliarity with basic social conventions, like property ownership, created awkward and tense situations. His wilderness experience had taught him that resources belong to whoever needs them most at any moment. The concept of permanent ownership and exclusive control, the very bedrock of agricultural society, was a completely foreign and illogical concept to him. Shamhat, the temple courtesan who had been sent to civilize him, became his essential guide. She was patient, introducing him not just to the practical skills of civilized life, how to eat with utensils, how to drink from a cup, how to wear proper clothing, but to the entire system of meanings and values that governed it. She explained the social hierarchies, the unspoken rules of interaction, the complex web of obligations and expectations that defined community life. It was an overwhelming flood of information, a constant sensory and intellectual overload that tested his adaptability and intelligence at every turn. As the traveling party finally approached Uruk, Enkidu got his first glimpse of the great city, and it was a sight that shocked his system. The massive walls surrounding the urban core rose higher than any natural formation he had ever encountered in the wilderness. The smoke from countless hearths, forges, and workshops created a permanent haze that obscured the horizon, and the sound, a constant low roar of voices, tools, animals, and machinery, was a stark contrast to the natural soundscape of the steppe. The entry into Uruk itself was a full-scale sensory assault. The narrow streets teemed with people engaged in activities he'd never imagined: craftsmen, hammering metal merchants, haggling over prices, priests conducting loud public rituals. The density of the human population within the city walls exceeded anything he had thought possible. The variety of occupations and social roles demonstrated a complexity of civilized society that was both awe-inspiring and deeply intimidating. The smells of spices, sewage perfume, and baking bread created a pungent tapestry that was nothing like the clean scents of earth and rain he knew. His arrival coincided with preparations for a royal wedding. But what should have been a joyous occasion marking the union of two prominent families had been transformed into a source of community-wide tension and simmering resentment. The king's assertion of jus primae noctis hung over the ceremony like a pall. The bride's family faced the profound humiliation of seeing their daughter subjected to the king's privilege before she could join her chosen husband. the groom's family struggled with the insult to their honor and status. The wedding preparations revealed the systematic, humiliating nature of Gilgamesh's oppression. The forced smiles and hollow congratulations reflected a community going through the motions of celebration while experiencing a collective trauma. Families with marriageable daughters lived in constant anxiety, and young men wondered if they could ever establish normal family relationships. The king's behavior had corrupted one of society's most fundamental institutions, turning marriage from a source of joy and stability into an instrument of royal domination. Enkidu's reaction to learning about this custom was immediate and visceral. His entire upbringing in the wilderness had been based on a clear code: protect the vulnerable and oppose any form of unnecessary cruelty or exploitation. The idea that a ruler would use his power to violate the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives struck him as fundamentally wrong, a direct contradiction of every principle of natural justice he understood. His moral outrage, already simmering from Shamhat's explanations, boiled over. The specific wedding that was unfolding became a focal point for all his growing anger. This wasn't an abstract concept anymore. It was a real injustice happening in front of him. The confrontation that was building would no longer be between a wild man and a civilization. It would be a clash between a natural sense of justice and the established corrupted power structure of Uruk. The stage was set. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because standing up to an unstoppable king in the middle of his own city, based on nothing but a gut feeling of what's right, you probably wouldn't survive this. But Enkidu was about to try. The wedding procession that wound through the streets of Uruk was a spectacle of stark contrasts. On the surface, it was all traditional celebration. Musicians played dancers, moved to ancient rhythms, and the air was thick with the smell of roasted meats and sacred incense. But beneath the pageantry, the atmosphere was choked with a palpable collective dread. Everyone knew what the evening would truly bring, not the joyful consummation of a marriage, but a royal violation. The forced smiles and hollow congratulations were a mask for a community enduring a shared trauma. It was into this tense, fractured scene that Enkidu planted himself a wild obstacle in the path of royal privilege. He positioned his massive frame directly in the route the king's procession would take. His appearance alone caused a sensation. The crowd, already on edge, gasped and murmured at the sight of this wild-haired, animal skin-clad giant who seemed to have emerged from a forgotten age. The royal guards, accustomed to a populace that cowered and made way, found their confidence shaken. They were facing an opponent whose very presence suggested capabilities far beyond any human they had ever encountered. The air grew electric, charged with the anticipation of an inevitable, unprecedented clash. Then Gilgamesh arrived. Expecting the usual cowering submission, the king instead found his path blocked by a figure who showed not a flicker of fear or deference. The two giants locked eyes in a moment of pure primal recognition. Gilgamesh, confident in his divine strength, saw for the first time someone whose physical presence seemed to mirror his own. Enkidu, steady and resolute, saw a king whose power had clearly corrupted him. The initial exchange between them was wordless, a silent assessment of strength, will, and intention. The crowd fell silent, understanding they were about to witness something that would redefine their city's history. The battle that erupted was unlike anything the citizens of Uruk had ever witnessed. This wasn't a ceremonial duel or a military skirmish. It was a raw collision of two natural forces. They grappled in the narrow streets, their struggle creating a spectacle that combined terrifying power with skilled, intelligent combat. The sound of their fight, grunts of effort, the impact of blows, the crash of bodies against walls echoed off the city's mud-brick buildings. The very ground seemed to tremble under the impact of their movements. They crashed into doorways and against walls, their battle raging across multiple city blocks, as neither could gain a decisive upper hand. Their fighting styles reflected their origins. Gilgamesh fought with the refined, deadly skills of a warrior king, using holds and throws perfected through years of military training and actual combat. His movements were disciplined, precise, and efficient. Enkidu, by contrast, relied on the raw power and instinctive reactions honed by years of survival in the wilderness. His style was less polished, but devastatingly effective, a combination of human intelligence and the fierce determination of a wild animal defending its territory. He fought with a kind of natural economy, every movement serving a purpose. The battle stretched on for hours from dawn until the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The crowd that had gathered to watch the spectacle slowly realized they were witnessing more than just a fight. The fact that neither could defeat the other was a revelation. Gilgamesh, who had dominated all challengers without effort, had finally met his absolute equal. The stalemate was a physical testament to a new balance of power. Exhaustion finally ended the titanic struggle. Both warriors, battered and breathless, collapsed in the dust of Uruk's central plaza. Their bodies were marked with the evidence of their conflict, but as they lay gasping for air, their eyes met. And in that look was something far more valuable than victory mutual recognition. They saw in each other an equal measure of strength and worth. The conflict that had brought them together had transformed into the foundation of something entirely new. The stunned silence of the crowd confirmed it. They had observed not just a fight, but the birth of a legend and the end of an era of solitary tyranny. The recovery period became a time of assessment and unexpected discovery. Gilgamesh, accustomed to effortless dominance, was genuinely impressed by Enkidu's raw power and unorthodox fighting instincts. More importantly, he recognized the moral courage in the wild man's willingness to risk everything to protect the innocent, a quality he rarely encountered in his subjects. Enkidu, for his part, saw in Gilgamesh a warrior whose refined skills commanded respect, but whose obvious loneliness suggested a man starved of the genuine companionship necessary for true growth. Their conversations conducted as their wounds healed revealed the extent of their complementary natures. Gilgamesh possessed knowledge of history, politics, and culture that fascinated Enkidu, while the wild man's understanding of the natural world and animal behavior opened entirely new perspectives for the king. They talked through the night, each discovering in the other a mind that matched his own intensity. The foundation for a transformative friendship was being laid brick by brick in the quiet aftermath of their violent meeting. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you, because going from trying to kill a guy to becoming his best friend over a series of deep, all-night chats, you probably wouldn't survive the emotional whiplash. But for these two, it was just the beginning. The transformation in Gilgamesh was immediate and profound. The presence of a true, equal companion who demanded neither obsequiousness nor offered empty flattery provided the emotional anchor that had been missing since his childhood. His divine heritage had always separated him, creating a gulf of loneliness that absolute power had only widened. That isolation had been the fertile ground where his cruelty took root. But Enkidu's friendship offered him the first genuine human connection he had experienced since ascending the throne, creating the foundation for something entirely new, self-reflection and moral growth. The citizens of Uruk observed these changes with a cautious, bewildered optimism. They watched as the king who had terrorized them began to rediscover his humanity. The most immediate and visible sign of this reformation was the cessation of the jus primae noctis. Royal guards simply stopped appearing at wedding ceremonies. The palpable fear that had hung over every betrothal began to lift, and families could once again celebrate marriages as joyful unions, not as preludes to violation. The excessive labor demands that had disrupted agricultural cycles and threatened the city's food supply were also dramatically reduced. People could return to the normal rhythms of work and rest that sustained both individual welfare and community prosperity. The city, which had been groaning under the weight of its king's ego, began to breathe again. But the most significant change in Gilgamesh's character was an internal one. The shallow satisfaction he'd previously derived from dominating his subjects was replaced by a growing restlessness, a hunger for meaningful challenges that would truly test his abilities against worthy opponents. His friendship with Enkidu had awoken an ambition that extended far beyond the boundaries of Uruk. He began to dream of achievements that would earn genuine glory, the kind born of respect and awe, rather than the mere fear and submission he had once cultivated. The idea of a grand quest, a journey to the legendary cedar forest, first emerged during one of their lengthy deep night conversations about the nature of heroism. Enkidu, sharing stories of his time in the wilderness, spoke of distant mountains where enormous trees grew in groves so ancient they seemed to touch the sky. But these groves, he warned, were protected by a fearsome supernatural guardian, a monster named Humbaba. These tales instantly captured Gilgamesh's imagination. He envisioned an expedition that would take them far from the familiar territories around Uruk into lands where their combined strength and courage would face the ultimate test. For Gilgamesh, this was more than an adventure. It was an opportunity to demonstrate that his reformed character had not diminished his courage or capabilities. It was also a practical mission. The cedar timber was a crucial resource prized throughout the ancient Near East for its durability, beauty, and resistance to insects and decay. It was the preferred material for constructing temples, palaces, and sacred objects. Securing a supply of this precious wood would fund civic projects and beautify Uruk for generations, transforming the expedition from a personal quest for glory into a service to the entire community. For Enkidu, the journey offered a chance to test his wilderness skills in an environment more challenging than the familiar steppe, while also supporting his friend's desire to achieve something worthy of his reborn spirit. The planning phase was a massive undertaking that mobilized the entire city. The distance to the cedar forest, located in the mountain ranges that would later be called Lebanon, was vast. The journey would take weeks through treacherous terrain with limited opportunities for resupply. The expedition required not just warriors, but skilled guides, experienced porters, and specialists in mountain travel. The mountainous environment demanded specialized equipment for climbing and camping, while the anticipated confrontation with Humbaba demanded weapons and armor of legendary quality. This led to one of the most significant metallurgical projects in Uruk's history. The city's master craftsmen, working under direct royal supervision, forged arms and armor specifically designed for a supernatural foe. They experimented with new alloys and techniques, creating blades that combined incredible hardness with the flexibility needed to withstand the stresses of a prolonged battle against an unknown horror. The axes forged for the expedition were massive two-handed weapons, each weighing nearly 200 pounds, designed to leverage the warrior's superhuman strength. Their blades were made from the finest bronze alloyed with precious tin, imported from distant lands, and their handles were carved from the hardest wood available and reinforced with bronze fittings. The swords were equally impressive, with blades over 4 feet long that could both cut and thrust. The armor was a masterpiece of balance made of bronze scales, individually shaped and fitted to provide protection without sacrificing the mobility and speed that defined their fighting style. The religious preparations were as crucial as the physical ones. The primary deity invoked for the mission was Shamash, the sun god. His domain included justice, law, and most importantly, the protection of travelers. His blessing was considered essential for any journey beyond the familiar territories where Uruk's local gods held sway. Elaborate ceremonies were conducted at dawn, Shamash's most powerful time, involving sacrifices of bulls and offerings of precious oils and incense. The priests emphasized that the mission was noble, motivated by service to the community, and a desire to test their courage against a worthy opponent, not by mere greed or conquest. The cedar wood would be used for temple construction and other projects that would honor the gods and benefit the people. The warriors themselves participated in purification rituals, fasting and meditating to focus their minds on the sacred nature of their mission. The entire city gathered to witness their departure, a procession of musicians, priests, and craftsmen accompanying them to the gates. It was a celebration of their courage and a send-off for a quest that would decide their fate. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because signing up to trek across the known world to fight a mythical monster in a cursed forest, you probably wouldn't survive the brochure description. But for Gilgamesh and Enkidu, it was just the next chapter. The great gates of Uruk swung open, and the expedition marched out not to war, but into the unknown. The procession that had accompanied them, the musicians, the priests, the representatives of every guild fell away, their celebratory cheers fading into the murmur of the city behind them. Ahead lay silence, distance, and the first real test of the bond between the king and the wild man. The initial leg of their journey was almost deceptively easy, a stroll through the familiar, human-tamed landscape surrounding Uruk. They passed orderly fields of grain, vibrant green against the rich, dark soil, and followed the neat geometric lines of irrigation canals that glinted in the sun. This was a world Gilgamesh understood completely, a world of control, of boundaries, of human dominion over nature. But as the days turned into a week, and then another, the landscape began to change. The neat fields gave way to rocky rolling hills, where the soil was too thin for farming. The well-maintained paths faded into animal tracks that required careful navigation. The climate shifted from the predictable heat of the river valley to something wilder and more unpredictable. Cool winds swept down from distant mountains, and the air grew humid, carrying the scent of pine and unknown flowers. This was the transition zone where the comfortable map of civilization ended and the blank space on the parchment began. For Gilgamesh, it was a journey into vulnerability. His royal authority meant nothing here. There were no subjects to command, no palaces to retreat to. For the first time in his life, he was entirely dependent on his own skills, and more importantly, on the expertise of his friend. Enkidu, in his element, became the unquestioned guide. He read the landscape like a scroll, pointing out hidden springs where the water was sweetest, identifying edible roots and plants that supplemented their supplies, and choosing campsites that were sheltered from the wind and invisible from any ridgeline. Gilgamesh watched and learned. The refined warrior king was getting a crash course in the raw fundamentals of survival. The physical toll was immense. Their muscles ached from the constant climb and descent. The polished surfaces of their magnificent weapons became dulled with dust and grime. The sleek armor felt less like a symbol of power and more like a heavy, necessary burden. The wildlife here was different too, wilder, more elusive, and more dangerous. They encountered mountain lions, whose eyes glinted from rocky outcrops, their challenging stares a far cry from the cowed animals of the royal menagerie. Bears rummaged in distant valleys, and packs of wolves tracked their progress from a wary distance. Every stream crossing held the potential for venomous snakes, and the air hummed with insects that found every patch of exposed skin. This was no longer a controlled hunt in a managed preserve. This was coexistence with forces that did not recognize kings. Hunting for their supper required new techniques. The game was smarter, faster, and required Enkidu's intimate knowledge of tracking and stalking. Gilgamesh's military precision found a new application in the patient, silent pursuit of a stag. Then the signs began. Subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The animal life grew scarce and nervous. Birds fell silent mid-song. The tracks they found were strange, deeper than any animals, and accompanied by marks that suggested something being dragged. The vegetation showed bizarre damaged trees, with bark stripped in great gouges, patches of ground scorched black as if by intense heat, yet with no evidence of lightning or campfires. The very air began to feel different, thicker, heavier, carrying a sense of watchful menace that raised the hairs on their arms. The porters and guides grew increasingly anxious, their prayers to Shamash becoming more frequent and fervent. Even Enkidu, who had faced down lions without flinching, grew quiet and alert, his senses stretched to their limit. Gilgamesh, for all his courage, felt a cold dread seeping into his bones. This was no longer just a journey. It was an approach to a threshold, and then they saw it. Through a pass in the foothills, the cedar forest itself rose before them. It was both magnificent and terrifying. The trees were colossal, their trunks wider than a dozen men, their branches forming a canopy so dense it plunged the forest floor into a perpetual green twilight gloom. The silence here was absolute and unnatural. No birds called, no insects chirped. It was a silence that felt like a held breath. The grandeur of the ancient trees was undercut by an oppressive sense of dread. This was not a peaceful grove. It was a fortress, and they were unwelcome at its gates. The scale of the trees they had come to harvest was dwarfed by the understanding of what guarded them. The adventure was over. The test was about to begin. They stood at the edge, weapons in hand, staring into the shadows where something ancient and angry waited. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because standing at the edge of a silent, cursed forest, knowing a monster is waiting for you inside, you probably wouldn't survive the walk home, let alone what comes next. The silence of the cedar forest was the first weapon deployed against them. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed the sound of their own breathing and the cautious crunch of their footsteps on the thick layer of fallen needles. The air, thick with the resinous scent of ancient cedar, carried an unnatural chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They moved in a perpetual twilight, the colossal branches high above filtering the sun into mere slivers of ghostly light. Every shadow seemed to shift and coalesce into monstrous shapes just at the edge of vision. This was not a place of life. It was a temple to primordial power, and they were trespassers in its deepest sanctum. The search for Humbaba was a nerve-shredding exercise in anticipation. They moved through the oppressive gloom, with weapons held ready, their senses strained to the breaking point. It was Enkidu who found the first undeniable proof of the Guardian's reality. Not a sight or a sound, but a track. A single massive footprint pressed deep into the soft earth near a stream. The claw marks within it were longer than a man's hand. Further on, they found more signs, trees with bark stripped away in great violent swathes, their trunks scarred by what could only be gigantic claws. In one clearing, they found an entire section of the forest, utterly devastated trees snapped like twigs, and the ground churned up as if by a titanic struggle. The evidence suggested that Humbaba's very rage could reshape the landscape. The confrontation began not with a sighting, but with a sound. A roar erupted from the depths of the forest, a sound so profound it was felt in the chest before it was heard by the ears. It echoed through the mountain valleys, seeming to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was a sound of pure ancient hatred for anything that walked on two legs. And then he emerged. The creature that stepped from the shadows was more terrifying than any legend could have conveyed. He stood nearly 20 feet tall, a horrific amalgamation of human and beast. His body was covered in scales that gleamed like polished bronze armor, and his eyes burned with an inner fire that seemed to look straight through their souls, laying bare their every fear. His breath came in clouds of superheated air that withered the vegetation around him and made the very atmosphere painful to breathe. The battle that followed was a desperate struggle for survival against a being whose power was fundamentally elemental. Humbaba's size and strength exceeded even their combined superhuman capabilities. His claws shredded the undergrowth and could easily shred their bronze armor. His breath was a weapon, a scorching blast that forced them to keep their distance. They were insects facing a hurricane. Their only advantages were speed coordination and the tactical intelligence that came from their deep friendship. They began to fight as a single entity, a whirlwind of coordinated strikes. Gilgamesh would feint high, drawing Humbaba's massive claws upward, and in that split second, Enkidu would dive low, hacking at the creature's legs. They used the dense trees for cover, darting between the massive trunks to avoid the blasts of superheated breath that set the wood smoldering. The turning point came through this perfect synergy. Enkidu, with a fearless roar, managed to dart inside the arc of a devastating swing and grapple one of Humbaba's massive arms. For a moment, the wild man's incredible strength locked the monster in place, his muscles straining against the divine power of the guardian. It was the opening Gilgamesh needed. He drove forward, his great sword flashing in a dim shaft of light, and delivered a crippling blow to the back of Humbaba's leg. The monster roared in agony, and surprise, his knee buckling. Brought down to one knee, his mobility shattered, Humbaba was suddenly vulnerable. And in that moment, the nature of the conflict changed. The fierce aggression in the monster's burning eyes dimmed, replaced by something unexpected desperation and then pleading. His voice when he spoke was a low rumble like grinding stone, but his words were clear. He begged for mercy. He offered to serve them to become the guardian of the forest under their authority. He argued his case not as a monster, but as a protector, a crucial part of the divine order, and promised to share the forest's riches with humans who approached with respect. His pleas were intelligent, emotionally complex, and horrifyingly logical. They revealed a consciousness within the beast, complicating the warrior's understanding of their mission in an instant. This wasn't just slaying a monster. It was the potential execution of a sentient being. A fierce, quick debate erupted between the friends. Enkidu, whose very essence was tied to the natural world, and its balance argued for accepting Humbaba's offer. He understood the value of a guardian, the importance of boundaries. To kill unnecessarily went against everything he was. But Gilgamesh the king thought of the future. He argued that sparing Humbaba would leave the threat intact for any future expedition. The mission was to secure the cedar for Uruk, and that required a permanent solution. He saw mercy as a risk they could not afford. The memory of the people counting on them and the personal glory of a complete victory tipped the scales. The final blow was delivered jointly, a grim shared act that symbolized their shared responsibility for the decision and its heavy consequences. As Humbaba's life faded, the forest itself seemed to revolt. The earth trembled with aftershocks, and an unnatural wind howled through the trees, carrying what sounded like mournful laments. The victory felt hollow, stained by the moral cost. They had won the battle, but they had also crossed a line, and the gods had taken notice. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because making a split-second decision to kill a sentient pleading being for the greater good, you probably wouldn't survive the guilt. But for Gilgamesh and Enkidu, the real consequences were just beginning. The return journey to Uruk was a paradox. They were triumphant, their porters straining under the weight of the magnificent aromatic cedar logs, a treasure beyond price. The wood itself was a marvel, its grain tight and resinous, filled with oils that would preserve it for centuries, destined to become the beams of glorious temples and the thrones of kings. Yet an undercurrent of unease tainted their victory. The memory of Humbaba's final intelligent pleas and the supernatural upheaval that followed his death haunted their every step. Strange dreams plagued their sleep visions of a disturbed celestial order and omens that felt less like congratulations and more like warnings. The victory felt Pyrrhic, the glory tinged with the copper scent of a wrong decision. The citizens of Uruk, however, saw only the triumph. They greeted their returning heroes with celebrations that lasted for days. The sight of the colossal cedar logs was all the proof they needed of their king's reformed greatness and his wild companion's valor. Gilgamesh and Enkidu were elevated to living legends, their names sung in every street and tavern. The cedar was immediately put to use by the city's master craftsmen, who considered it the highest honor to work the timber won through such extraordinary courage. The weapons and armor that had vanquished Humbaba were polished to a mirror brightness and displayed in the royal palace as sacred trophies. In the eyes of his people, Gilgamesh was at the zenith of his power, a tyrant transformed into a heroic, benevolent king. But the divine realm had taken notice, and its response was not celebration. The killing of Humbaba had been a transgression, a violation of a boundary set by the gods. He was not merely a guardian of trees, he was a crucial component in the divine order, a regulator of the relationship between civilization and the untamed world. His death sent ripples through the cosmic hierarchy, and they reached the ears of a goddess known for her passionate and perilous attention, Ishtar. The goddess observed the celebrations in Uruk from her celestial palace, her divine senses attuned to the shifting currents of power and ambition in the mortal world. The sight of Gilgamesh at the height of his glory, his body bronzed by the mountain sun, his frame radiating the confidence of victory, stirred something within her. This was not mere physical desire, it was a calculated interest. His transformation from tyrant to hero had created a figure of compelling attraction, and a union with him promised more than romance. It offered a partnership that could reshape the balance of power between the divine and mortal realms, giving the Queen of Heaven a champion whose achievements already rivaled those of legendary heroes. Ishtar began her approach with divine subtlety. She appeared to Gilgamesh in dreams and visions, gradually intensifying his awareness of her presence. Her initial manifestations were blessings. Harvests in Uruk's territories became abnormally abundant. Trade negotiations concluded with surreal success. Potential military threats dissolved without any effort. These divine favors were accompanied by increasingly vivid dreams, where Ishtar appeared in forms of ever-increasing beauty and allure, clouding his judgment with desire and divine ambition. When she finally revealed herself in person, It was a calculated assault on the senses. She manifested in her aspect as the goddess of love and beauty, her form radiating an otherworldly perfection that made the most beautiful mortal woman seem like a rough clay doll. Her skin had the luminous quality of polished ivory. Her hair fell in waves of deepest black that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, and her eyes held the depth of night skies filled with stars. Her garments were woven from captured starlight and crystallized moonbeams, shifting color and texture with her every movement. Precious stones that had never been seen on Earth decorated her clothing, their surfaces reflecting images of distant worlds. The very air around her shimmered with power, creating an aura of supernatural authority that commanded both reverence and raw desire. Her proposition was delivered with the confidence of a deity accustomed to instant obedience. She offered him not just her affections, but a partnership. She promised him dominion over territories beyond earthly kingdoms, a chariot of precious metals and gemstones to ride across the heavens, and a palace expanded to rival the dwellings of the gods themselves, complete with gardens of eternal bloom and fruit that granted extended youth. The military advantages were equally staggering: command of legions of supernatural warriors and tributes from kings across the known world. It was an offer of godlike power on a silver platter, but Gilgamesh's response revealed the profound wisdom and moral growth forged in the cedar forest and tempered by his friendship with Enkidu. Rather than being overwhelmed, he analyzed her offer with the cold precision of a ruler who had learned to weigh long-term consequences. He acknowledged her beauty and the attractiveness of her offers. But then, with a shocking lack of diplomatic tact, he proceeded to catalog the fates of her previous lovers with the meticulous detail of a courtroom lawyer. He began with Tammuz, the shepherd god, whose annual death and descent into the underworld was directly caused by Ishtar's fickle affections. He listed the birdcatcher she transformed into a mole condemned to perpetual darkness, the gardener she changed into a frog, the lion her former companion trapped in pitfalls of her own devising when his strength began to rival her own. The shepherd became a wolf, hunted by his own dogs. The horse trainer was transformed into a stallion and broken to the harness. Each story reinforced the same pattern: initial favor, followed by inevitable abandonment and cruel, transformative punishment. Gilgamesh's rejection was firm. He demonstrated a sophisticated understanding that her behavior stemmed not from malice, but from the fundamental incompatibility between immortal caprice and mortal needs. His divine heritage, which once would have made him leap at such an offer, now allowed him to see the trap for what it was. He chose to forego immediate godhood in favor of preserving his autonomy and his very soul. He had looked into the eyes of a monster and seen a plea for life. He would not become another of the goddess's tragic trophies. Ishtar's reaction was immediate and volcanic. Her divine pride, never before challenged by a mortal, shattered. Her beautiful form transformed into terrifying majesty, her eyes blazing like furnaces, her voice carrying the power of storms and earthquakes. The air crackled with supernatural energy that made the stones of the palace tremble. Gilgamesh's rejection wasn't just a personal insult. It was a challenge to the very divine order, a precedent that threatened to undermine the authority of all gods over all mortals. And her wrath would be cosmic. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because rejecting the marriage proposal of an all-powerful goddess known for her vengeful temper, you probably wouldn't survive the polite refusal. But Gilgamesh had just signed his city's death warrant. Ishtar's rage was not a mere emotional outburst. It was a cosmic event. Her beautiful features contorted into a mask of terrifying majesty, her eyes blazing with the heat of a divine forge. The air in Gilgamesh's palace crackled with unleashed power, making the very stones of the walls tremble. But her fury was not without calculation. Directly striking down, a king, especially one of semi-divine heritage, would violate divine law and risk conflict with other gods. Instead, she turned her wrath toward a higher authority, her father Anu, the king of the gods. Her journey to the celestial realm was a tempest. Stars seemed to shift in their courses as she passed, and cosmic winds carried the scent of her divine fury across the heavens. Her arrival at Anu's palace shook its foundations, and her demands for justice echoed through the halls with a force that commanded attention from every deity in the pantheon. Her petition was a masterful blend of personal grievance and theological argument. She portrayed Gilgamesh's rejection not just as an insult to her dignity, but as a dangerous precedent, a fundamental challenge to divine authority itself. If a mortal could refuse a goddess without consequence, she argued it would encourage acts of defiance throughout the human world, ultimately eroding the respect and reverence that maintained the cosmic order. Her demand was specific. She wanted the bull of heaven. Anu was reluctant. He knew the bull was not merely a weapon, but a force of nature, a being whose very existence threatened the stability of the natural order. Unleashing it upon the earth was an act of catastrophic imbalance. But faced with his daughter's relentless world-shaking fury, he finally consented. The bull of heaven was released from its celestial stable. Its materialization in the fields outside Uruk was an apocalyptic event. Its hooves struck the earth with such force that deep fissures cracked open for miles in every direction, swallowing irrigation channels and toppling boundary markers. Its breath was a scorching wind that withered entire fields of grain in an instant, turning a harvest-ready landscape into a desiccated wasteland. The creature itself was a vision of divine wrath made flesh. Its hide gleamed like impenetrable polished bronze, and its eyes burned with the same malevolent fire that had once blazed in Humbaba's gaze. Its horns, each longer than a man is tall, could gore through the strongest mud brick fortifications as if they were cloth. The destruction that followed was systematic and merciless. The bull's rampage through Uruk's agricultural districts destroyed years of careful cultivation in a matter of hours. The complex irrigation systems that had sustained the city's population for generations were demolished, their carefully engineered channels shattered and filled with rubble. The economic foundation of Gilgamesh's kingdom crumbled in real time. Storage facilities were crushed, their precious contents scattered and ruined. The fissures in the earth made trade routes completely impassable. The delicate balance between urban civilization and agricultural production that had made Uruk prosperous was shattered in a single morning. The human cost was staggering. Hundreds of citizens died in the initial attack, caught in the path of the bull's rage, or swallowed by the opening earth. Thousands more were left homeless and destitute as entire city blocks were demolished by single blows from the creature's head or trampling hooves. The bull's fiery breath created infernos that consumed everything in their path: homes, workshops, temples. The air filled with a cacophony of terror, the screams of the dying, the crash of collapsing buildings, the panicked cries of those fleeing. The smoke from burning structures darkened the sky, blocking out the sun and casting the city in an eerie orange twilight. The pride and prosperity that had characterized Uruk under Gilgamesh's reformed rule were replaced by pure terror and desperation. The battle that Gilgamesh and Enkidu fought against this divine instrument was their greatest test yet. The creature's sheer size and supernatural nature made conventional combat tactics useless. Their finest weapons glanced off its bronze-like hide. They were forced to rely entirely on their speed, their coordination, and their deep knowledge of each other's movements. They danced around the enraged beast, using the crumbling cityscape as their arena, drawing it away from concentrations of people. The turning point came through another breathtaking act of trust and synergy. Enkidu, with a fearless cry, managed to leap and grasp the bull's massive horns, using his entire body weight and his wild-born strength to wrestle the creature's head down, holding it in a temporary, straining stalemate. It was the opening Gilgamesh needed. He drove forward his great sword, finding a seam in the divine armor at the base of the bull's skull. The killing blow was delivered with all his might. The bull's death was as supernatural as its life. Its body did not fall as a corpse. It dissolved into a cloud of golden dust that scattered on the wind, leaving behind only the memory of its destruction and the devastating scars it had carved into the land and the people. For a moment, there was silence. They had done it. They had defended their city against the god's wrath. But their victory was the worst kind of triumph. They had now killed two divine beings. The first had been a guardian. This was an outright instrument of a major deity. The defiance was no longer implicit. It was direct, and the gods would not let it stand. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because surviving a battle against a divinely sent monster is one thing. Surviving the council of angry gods that comes after you probably wouldn't survive the opening statement. The golden dust of the bull of heaven had barely settled before the real judgment began. The divine council convened in the celestial realm, presided over by a weary Anu. This was no minor squabble. It was a full-blown cosmic crisis. Two mortals had now slain Humbaba, a divine guardian, and the bull of heaven and direct instrument of Ishtar's wrath. This wasn't just defiance. It was a pattern of behavior that challenged the very foundations of divine authority over the mortal world. The debate that unfolded was not a simple trial, but a profound philosophical conflict about the nature of mortals, gods, and justice. Enlil, the god of wind and storms, was the first to speak, and his voice was like thunder, echoing through the celestial hall. He argued with fierce, uncompromising logic. Gilgamesh and Enkidu deserved death. Their actions were not just crimes against Ishtar, but against the entire cosmic order. Allowing such blatant defiance to go unpunished would set a catastrophic precedent, encouraging rebellion across the human world. His position was clear. Traditional and severe mortals must remain subordinate regardless of their achievements. To him, the heroes were a virus that needed to be purged to maintain the health of the universe. But Shamash, the sun god, who had blessed their expedition, rose to their defense. His was a more nuanced perspective. He pointed out that the warriors had acted with courage and honor. They defended their city against a divinely sanctioned monster. Their victories were won through legitimate means, their own strength and skill, not through trickery or stolen divine power. To punish heroes for protecting their people, he argued, would create a terrible contradiction. It would show the gods as petty and unjust, damaging their credibility with the mortals whose worship sustained them. He appealed not to law, but to a higher morality. Then came the most poignant voice, Uruk, the goddess of creation. She found herself in a painfully conflicted position. She was there to defend her creation, Enkidu, the being she had shaped from clay, to be a solution, not a problem. She reminded the council of his original purpose to moderate Gilgamesh's behavior and transform a tyrant into a just ruler. In this, he had succeeded, brilliantly benefiting both Uruk and the cosmic order. However, With a heavy heart, she also acknowledged the validity of Enlil's concerns. Enkidu's continued existence paired with Gilgamesh did pose a risk. Their combined power and willingness to challenge divine will could indeed encourage further instability. Her argument was one of tragic necessity. The compromise that emerged from the council's painful deliberations was a masterstroke of cruel divine logic. Some punishment was absolutely necessary to reassert cosmic authority and maintain balance. But the complete destruction of both heroes felt excessive, a waste of the remarkable qualities that even the gods had to respect. The solution was a balanced, heartbreaking verdict. One of the two friends must die. The choice of Enkidu as the sacrifice was influenced by cold, bureaucratic divinity. As a created being, fashioned by Uruk rather than born of man and woman, his death was deemed less disruptive to the natural mortal order. Gilgamesh, despite his semi-divine nature, was still a king in a line of kings, a part of the earthly political structure. His removal would create chaos in Uruk. Enkidu's death, however, would serve as a sufficient demonstration of divine power, while preserving the life of the survivor as a testament to the god's capacity for mercy. It was clean, efficient, and utterly devastating. The sentence was carried not with a bolt of lightning, but with a subtle, insidious sickness. A divine illness began to consume Enkidu from within. It first announced itself in his dreams. Vivid, horrifying visions invaded his sleep, sent by the gods as harbingers of his doom. He was forced to witness the bleak, joyless reality of the Mesopotamian underworld, a dusty gray realm of perpetual twilight, where the dead existed as faded echoes of their former selves. He saw former kings and commoners alike stripped of all status and possession, wandering the barren plains in identical garments of feathers. The dreams emphasized the universal egalitarian misery of death, a stark contrast to the vibrant life he had come to love. The visions grew more intense, featuring the terrifying guardian of the underworld gates, a being with the features of a bird of prey, whose claws could tear through any deception and whose eyes saw all. This being's presence was a final, unmistakable warning his fate was sealed. No earthly power could prevent his journey to the land of no return. Then the physical decay began. His superhuman strength, which had allowed him to wrestle the bull of heaven, ebbed away like water from a cracked vessel. His preternaturally sharp senses, capable of tracking a gazelle across vast distances, grew dull and unreliable. The magnificent vitality that had sustained him through years in the wilderness and battles with monsters drained from his body, leaving him weak, bedridden, and increasingly dependent on others for his most basic needs. The psychological toll was even worse than the physical. For a being created for strength and survival, the helplessness was a torture in itself. The fear and confusion of confronting mortality for the first time created an emotional turmoil that was visible to everyone who came near him. The wild man, who had faced down monsters without flinching, was now laid low by a sickness no sword could fight. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because watching your best friend slowly fade away from a curse you can't break, knowing you're the reason it happened, you probably wouldn't survive the guilt. But for Gilgamesh, the worst was yet to come. The divine illness was a cruel, slow unraveling. The vibrant wilderness spirit that was Enkidu was being systematically erased, replaced by a wasting shell of pain and delirium. As the sickness tightened its grip, his mind clouded with fever, and visions of the bleak underworld turned its anguish outward. In his suffering, he sought someone to blame for the chain of events that had led him from his free life in the steppe to this deathbed in a civilized prison. His initial venomous rage fell upon the trapper, the first human who had ever laid eyes on him, and set the entire tragedy in motion. The curse he pronounced was comprehensive and vicious. He called for the trapper's livelihood to be destroyed, for his hunting paths to forever be barren, for his traps to remain eternally empty. He wished for his wealth to vanish, and for his very name to be forgotten, erased from the world he had inadvertently helped change. The intensity of this anger was a reflection of Enkidu's deepest regret that his encounter with humanity had led him to this futile, inglorious end. He was dying not in battle, but in a bed, a fate worse than any for a creature of the wild. Then his wrath turned to Shamhat, the temple courtesan. In his delirium, he forgot her kindness, her patience, her crucial role in his awakening. He saw only the catalyst that had pulled him from his natural state. His curse upon her was particularly cruel, calling for her to be abandoned by all who sought her companionship to wander in poverty and disgrace. Her beauty faded and her comfort gone. The bitterness of this condemnation revealed the depth of his despair. He was rejecting the entire civilized world that had in his eyes betrayed him, with its complexities and its ultimate divine injustice. But as the illness progressed and the worst of the fever broke, a clarity emerged. His mind, no longer clouded by rage and pain, began to clear. The intervention of the sun god Shamash, who had always favored them, was subtle but profound. A sense of divine perspective settled upon Enkidu, perhaps a final mercy from the god who had blessed their quest. Lying there, his body broken, but his spirit becoming lucid, he began to see his journey not as a curse, but as a story with meaning. He remembered the joy he had found in Gilgamesh's friendship, a bond deeper and more powerful than any he had known among the animals. He recalled the satisfaction of protecting a city, of fighting for a purpose greater than his own survival. He saw his life not as a fall from grace, but as an ascent into something richer, even if it ended in tragedy. This wisdom, hard-won on the threshold of death, softened his heart. In a moment of profound peace, he transformed his curses into blessings. His blessing upon the trapper was an acknowledgement of the man's unwitting role in a larger destiny. He wished him success and prosperity, his hunting grounds forever abundant. For Shamhat, his blessing was generous and poetic. He called for her to be honored by kings and princes, for her wisdom to be sought after, and for her life to be filled with abundance and respect. He recognized that her actions, though they had led him to his end, had also given him his beginning as a conscious being. This transformation from curse to blessing was Enkidu's final and greatest act, a conscious choice to embrace the beauty of his brief, extraordinary life rather than rage against its end. For Gilgamesh, the vigil at his friend's bedside was a unique and excruciating torture. His initial response was fierce denial. He summoned the finest physicians in Uruk, consulted priests and soothsayers, and offered extravagant sacrifices to every god in the pantheon, desperately seeking a remedy. He promised personal wealth, temple tributes, anything for a divine intervention. The failure of these efforts to produce even a moment of improvement was a hammer blow each day. He was forced to watch the strongest man he had ever known be reduced to a gaunt, helpless form. The wild mane of hair became thin and lifeless. The eyes that had blazed with wilderness, fire grew dim and unfocused, and the voice that could command animals became a weak whisper. The physical changes were heartbreaking, but the psychological impact on Gilgamesh was what truly shattered him. His own divine heritage, which had always made him feel superior, offered no protection against this grief and helplessness. He was forced to confront a terrifying truth. All his strength, his royal authority, his semi-divine power were utterly useless against the silent, inevitable approach of death. The friendship, that had transformed him from a tyrant into a just ruler was being destroyed by forces beyond his control, and he was powerless to stop it. The fear of returning to the isolation that had originally corrupted his character created a panic that infected his every thought. The final breath escaped Enkidu's lips at dawn. Gilgamesh, who had kept his vigil through the long night, initially refused to believe it. He pressed his ear to his friend's chest, searching desperately for a heartbeat that would never come. The stillness was absolute. The massive frame that had wrestled divine bulls was now as motionless as stone. Gilgamesh's response was a roar of anguish that echoed through the palace, a sound of such raw emotion that it moved hardened guards and servants to tears. It was not just a cry of grief. It was a challenge hurled at the gods themselves, a denial of their authority to take the one thing that gave his life meaning. For 7 days and 7 nights, Gilgamesh refused to allow anyone to remove the body. He stood guard like a lion over its cub, his great sword drawn, his eyes hollow and haunted. His appearance became shocking, hair disheveled, royal garments stained with tears and dirt. The administrative machinery of Uruk ground to a halt. Officials, trade delegations, diplomatic missions, all were turned away. The kingdom existed in a state of suspended animation, frozen by its king's all-consuming grief. It was only the undeniable natural evidence of decay, the changing skin, the scent of mortality, and finally, the appearance of insects claiming their domain that broke through even Gilgamesh's denial. He finally had to accept that the body was no longer his friend. It was just clay returning to the earth. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because facing the cold final reality of death, after denying it for so long, you probably wouldn't survive the collapse. But for Gilgamesh, this was just the beginning of his darkest journey. The grandest funeral in Uruk's history could not fill the void. The tomb was a marvel carved deep into the earth and filled with treasures, precious metals, gemstones, and artifacts from across the known world. The funeral couch was crafted from the very cedar wood they had won together, its surface inlaid with gold and silver, telling the story of their adventures. Kings and princes came to pay their respects to the wild man who had become a legend. The procession of mourners stretched for miles. But for Gilgamesh, it was all dust. The ceremonies, the honors, the wealth, it was meaningless pageantry that could not answer the fundamental question Enkidu's death had raised. What was the point of it all? If it ended in decay and silence, a profound shift occurred in the king. The royal duties that had once given his life structure and purpose now seemed like a hollow joke. Administrative meetings dealing with trade disputes and grain storage quotas were exercises in absurdity when measured against the cosmic forces that had claimed his friend. He would sit on his throne, his mind 1,000 miles away, lost in memories of the cedar forest or the battle with the bull of heaven. His participation in the business of ruling became mechanical, distracted. His citizens, who had celebrated his transformation, now watched with growing concern as their king's grief threatened to undo all the progress he had made. Then he began to abandon his responsibilities entirely. Court sessions were delayed or canceled. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that reinforced his authority felt like empty gestures. The transformation in his appearance was shocking. His carefully groomed beard grew wild and unkempt. His hair became matted and disheveled from his habit of pulling at it in moments of anguish. He abandoned his royal garments, the symbols of his divine heritage and power, in favor of simple, crude robes. His skin, once bronzed and healthy, grew pale and drawn from sleepless nights and a refusal to eat. The most dramatic symbol of his rejection was his decision to don animal skins. But these weren't the prepared garments of a hunter. They were the raw, reeking pelts of animals that had died natural deaths, roughly fashioned into coverings. It was a deliberate visceral rejection of the civilized world that had failed to protect his friend. By wearing the skin of a beast, he was adopting the symbols of Enkidu's original home, trying to maintain a connection to the only thing that had ever given his life meaning. He was shedding his identity as the king of Uruk and becoming something else entirely, a wanderer, an exile driven by a single consuming terror. The fear of death that Enkidu's passing had awakened in him became an all-consuming obsession. His divine heritage, which had always made him feel superior, now seemed like the cruelest trick of all. It had allowed him to form an attachment so profound that its severance was unbearable, and it would force him to witness the death of everyone he ever cared about while he lived on. The prospect of an eternity of such loss was unimaginable. This terror drove him to seek a solution that rational thought would dismiss as impossible. He would simply conquer death. His flight from Uruk was not a planned expedition. It was a desperate pre-dawn escape. He slipped past guards, too stunned by his wild appearance to challenge him. The great gates of the city that had once symbolized his power now felt like the walls of a tomb. The wilderness beyond called to him with promises of solitude, and the faint, desperate hope that answers to his existential dread lay somewhere in the unknown. The physical challenges were immediate and brutal. The skills Enkidu had taught him were now all that stood between him and death. He learned to find water in barren landscapes, to identify edible plants, to sleep on rocky ground exposed to the elements. The hardships were a form of penance, a way to feel close to his friend, and a constant distraction from the gnawing fear in his gut. The animal skins he wore became tattered and offered little protection. His magnificent weapons became tools for basic survival, their edges chipped and dulled. His mind turned to the stories of his royal education, the ancient legends he had once considered mere mythology. One tale surfaced above all others, the story of Utnapishtim. This was no god, but a mortal man who had survived the Great Flood and had been granted immortality by the gods as a reward. The story, which had once seemed like a fable, now appeared as a beacon of hope. It offered a path, a precedent. If one man had achieved eternal life, then it was possible. His quest crystallized. He would find Utnapishtim in his distant hidden realm and learn the secret of cheating death. It was a journey toward understanding the fundamental nature of existence itself. The transformation was complete. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, was gone. In his place was a wandering hero, his royal authority exchanged for the freedom and terrifying uncertainty of a life devoted to pursuing the impossible. The palace was a distant memory. The wilderness was his new home. His journey would take him to the very edges of the known world, to places where the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms blurred, and where the answer to humanity's oldest fear might finally be found. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because abandoning your kingdom and your identity to wander into certain doom based on an ancient fairy tale, you probably wouldn't survive the first night. But Gilgamesh was just getting started. The landscape beyond Uruk twisted into something alien and hostile. The familiar sun-baked plains gave way to jagged black mountains that clawed at a sky the color of bruised metal. The air grew thin and carried a metallic taste, as if the very mixture of elements that sustained life was being slowly replaced. Gilgamesh moved through valleys shrouded in mists that never lifted, a perpetual twilight that disoriented the senses and hid the path behind him. This was no longer the earth he knew. It was a liminal space, a borderland between the world of mortals and the domain of things that should not be. The wildlife here was strange and watchful creatures, with too many eyes or silent movements that suggested intelligence far beyond that of a beast. They did not attack, but observed as if testing his resolve, judging his worthiness to proceed further into the unknown. His body, once a symbol of divine strength, was wearing down. The muscle and vitality that had made him a match for gods and monsters were slowly ebbing under the constant strain of exposure, poor nutrition, and the relentless grind of survival. The animal skins he wore were in tatters, offering little protection against the elements. His weapons, once polished trophies, were now dull-nicked tools for hacking through thorny undergrowth or prying open crevices for water. The solitude was absolute, a physical and spiritual isolation that forced him to confront his thoughts without distraction. The silence was broken only by the sound of his own movement and the occasional unsettling call of something unseen in the gloom. In this void, his mind began to play tricks on him. Whispers seemed to echo in the rock, and the wind carried fragments of conversations in dead languages. He was unraveling. Then he saw at Mount Mashu, the legendary twin-peaked mountain that served as the gateway to the underworld and the realm of the sun. It was a terrifying sight, a mass of black stone that seemed to stretch infinitely upward, its summits lost in clouds that glowed with a sickly inner light. The base of the mountain was shrouded in a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the little light that existed, creating a zone of absolute shadow. The silence here was heavier than anywhere else, a dead void, where not even the wind dared to whisper. All natural life had been banished from this threshold between worlds. Carved into the living rock of the mountain was a perfect circular entrance, the tunnel. Its edges were smooth and precise, a feat of craftsmanship that screamed of divine, not mortal hands. The interior walls were covered in symbols and inscriptions older than any cuneiform, their meanings lost to time. The tunnel stretched away into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical substance, a blackness that even the brightest torch could penetrate for only a few feet before being utterly consumed. And guarding this passage were the scorpion beings. Their forms were a horrific amalgamation that defied nature. From the waist up, they were humanoid, with muscular torsos covered in chitinous plates that gleamed like polished bronze. Their arms ended in claws, capable of crushing stone, and their faces, while human, had eyes that glowed with an inner fire that saw through any deception. From the waist down, their bodies were those of enormous scorpions with segmented tails that curved over their backs, tipped with stingers that dripped with venom potent enough to kill a god. They did not attack. Instead, they subjected him to a silent, telepathic interrogation that felt like having his mind dissected by alien intelligences. They examined his thoughts, his motivations, his deepest fears about mortality. The process was invasive and deeply unsettling. It was the revelation of his divine parentage through his mother Ninsun that ultimately convinced them to grant him passage. His semi-divine nature marked him as one of the few mortals who might survive the journey through the mountain's heart. But they offered a grave warning: his heritage alone would not guarantee success. The path ahead would test his soul, not his strength. The journey through the tunnel was an ordeal that lasted 12 hours in absolute suffocating darkness. The walls seemed to shift and change around him, sometimes narrowing until he had to crawl on hands and knees, other times opening into vast, echoing chambers where his footsteps faded into nothing. The air was stale and oppressive, carrying the scent of ancient dust and something else, the breath of sleeping gods, perhaps. The complete sensory deprivation warped his perception of time. Minutes felt like hours. Hours compressed into moments. He began to hear things, distant water whispers, in dead languages, the sound of his own name called from behind. His sanity hung by a thread, sustained only by the desperate image of Enkidu's face and the hope that lay beyond this nightmare. His emergence from the tunnel was so abrupt and overwhelming, it was physically painful. He stumbled out of the consuming blackness and into the garden of the gods. The realm beyond Mount Mashu existed in a state of perpetual dawn, a soft golden light that seemed to emanate from the air itself. He was temporarily blinded, his eyes struggling to adjust after the long darkness. When his vision cleared, he saw a paradise that defied all earthly logic. This was no simple garden. Trees bore fruit made of glittering sapphires, golden pears, and silver grapes. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no name. Paths of mirror-bright stone wound through landscapes of impossible beauty, and streams of crystal-clear water flowed in channels lined with gold and silver. The trees were not merely decorative. They were repositories of divine knowledge. The sapphire apples of one tree contained all knowledge accumulated since time began. The golden pears from another could restore youth and vitality. The silver grapes of a third offered glimpses of future events. This was a place of answers, but those answers came at a cost. The beings who tended this garden were not the familiar gods of Mesopotamia. They were primordial entities, figures of living light, whose forms shifted between impossible beauty and geometric patterns that hurt to look upon. They communicated with him, not through speech, but by transmitting meaning directly into his consciousness. Their guidance was cryptic, offering hints about the location of Utnapishtim's dwelling across a supernatural ocean without providing a clear map. They spoke of tests that would require wisdom, not strength, and challenges that could not be overcome by conventional means. They offered him divine gifts, weapons provisions, but warned that accepting too much aid would compromise the authenticity of his quest. He had to choose his path and his tools with care. The balance between seeking help and relying on his own hard-won resolve was the next test on his journey to cheat death. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because choosing between a magical weapon and your own stubborn will, when the next step is a cosmic ocean, you probably wouldn't survive the indecision. But Gilgamesh had come too far to turn back now. Beyond the garden of the gods stretched an ocean that defied all laws of nature. This was not water as Gilgamesh knew it. Its surface did not reflect the sky, but shimmered with images of distant realms and possible futures, shifting and melting into one another with each passing moment. The substance itself seemed to exist in multiple states, at once sometimes appearing as liquid, other times as crystallized light, or even solidified time. The shore was not sand, but ground pearls and pulverized gemstones that crunched underfoot, and the waves made a sound like distant celestial music played on instruments no mortal ear should hear. This was the waters of death, and to cross them was to journey through the very fabric of existence. The ferryman who operated the only vessel capable of this crossing was a figure named Urshanabi. He was not old in a human sense, but ancient in a way that spoke of epochs, not years. His eyes held the patience of deep time, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as if he himself were part of the timeless landscape. His boat was a craft of impossible beauty, seemingly carved from a single enormous pearl, with sails woven from threads of pure moonlight. It did not move by wind or oar, but glided soundlessly over the surreal waters, responding to Urshanabi's will alone. The ferryman did not speak. Instead, he subjected Gilgamesh to a test of action. he pointed to a pile of strange stone poles on the pearl-white shore. Gilgamesh, in his impatience and lingering arrogance, saw them as tools. He seized them and began using them to push the boat forward as if it were a simple river barge. But each time a pole touched the waters of death, the water sizzled, and the stone dissolved into nothingness. They were not tools for propulsion, they were the test. Urshanabi watched his expression unreadable as Gilgamesh exhausted himself, destroying every single pole in a futile attempt to force his way across. It was only when Gilgamesh stood empty-handed, humbled, and finally understanding that his strength was useless here that Urshanabi nodded. The king had passed. He had demonstrated the desperation required, and now he had learned the necessary humility. The ferryman willed the boat to move, and they began their silent passage. The crossing was a form of purification. As they glided across the waters that were not waters, the accumulated grime of his journey, the dust of the desert, the sweat of fear, the pride of kingship seemed to wash away. Visions assailed him, glimpses of his life in Uruk, of Enkidu's laughing face, of the terrible moment of his death. They were temptations to abandon his quest to lose himself in memory or regret. To stay focused on his goal amid this psychic onslaught was the true challenge of the crossing. He was being stripped bare, not physically, but spiritually prepared for the audience that awaited him. The island where Utnapishtim dwelled was a place outside of time. It was perfectly preserved, untouched by decay or change, as if the moment the great flood's waters receded had been frozen for eternity. The air itself was different, carrying the lingering scent of rain, and deep earth mixed with the faint ozone trace of divine wrath. And there, waiting on the shore, was the man himself, Utnapishtim, the immortal. He was not a figure of glorious power, but of profound and quiet sadness. His body showed no sign of aging, but his eyes held the weight of countless centuries and the memory of a world wiped clean. He wore simple, practical clothing made from materials that had been common before the flood, but were now lost to history. His every movement was careful, reverent, as if he were intensely aware of the fragility of the existence he had been granted. Gilgamesh poured out his heart. He spoke of his grief for Enkidu, his terror of death, his desperate journey. He begged for the secret of eternal life. Utnapishtim listened in silence, his ancient eyes seeing not just a king, but the universal human fear that stood before him. And when Gilgamesh finished, the old man's response was not what he expected. He did not offer a secret potion or a magical incantation. Instead, he challenged Gilgamesh's very premise. "Why do you struggle so against the common lot of men?" he asked. To seek immortality was to struggle against the very fabric of creation, a fabric the gods had woven with mortality as its central thread. To make his point, Utnapishtim imposed a test. It seemed simple, almost insultingly so. "If you think you can overcome death," he said, "then overcome sleep, its younger brother. Stay awake for 6 days and 7 nights." Gilgamesh, confident in his divine stamina, agreed. He sat down, determined to prove his worth. But the exhaustion of his epic journey, the physical toll of crossing deserts and mountains, the psychological weight of grief and fear, the spiritual ordeal of the tunnel, and the cosmic ocean crashed down upon him all at once. Almost immediately, sleep, the mist that steams up from the earth, as Utnapishtim called it, overcame him. He slept for the entire 6 days and 7 nights. To prove the passage of time, Utnapishtim's wife had baked a loaf of bread and placed it beside Gilgamesh each day. When the king finally awoke, convinced only a moment had passed, Utnapishtim showed him the loaves. The first was dry and hard as stone. The next was slightly less desiccated, and so on down to the 7th loaf, which was still fresh from the oven. The physical evidence was undeniable. Gilgamesh had failed the simplest possible test of his mortal nature. He could not even conquer sleep, let alone death. He wept in utter despair. The quest was over. He had reached the end of the earth, found the immortal man, and been proven fundamentally, inescapably human. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because failing a test, you were so sure you'd ace, and having the proof laid out in a line of stale bread, you probably wouldn't survive the humiliation. But Utnapishtim, perhaps out of pity, was about to offer a consolation prize. Seeing Gilgamesh's utter devastation, a profound pity stirred within Utnapishtim. His wife, too, was moved by the king's raw grief. In a hushed conversation away from the broken hero, they decided to offer him not the immortality he sought, but a consolation prize, a secret the immortal man had never intended to share. He called Gilgamesh over and spoke of a plant that grew at the very bottom of the cosmic ocean, in the deepest, most lightless trenches where the pressure could crush a mortal form. This was not the plant of immortality, but the plant of rejuvenation. Its property was not to grant eternal life, but to restore a man's youth. A mortal could use it to continually reset his age, a form of conditional immortality that required constant vigilance and renewal. It was a second chance, a loophole, but not the ultimate victory Gilgamesh had crossed the world to find. A spark of desperate hope rekindled in Gilgamesh's eyes. It was not everything, but it was something. It was a fight he could still win. Tying heavy stones to his feet to sink himself into the crushing depths, Gilgamesh dove into the supernatural waters. The pressure was immense, a weight threatening to collapse his lungs and bones. The darkness was absolute, and the waters themselves felt alive, resistant to his intrusion. But his will hardened by loss, and journey was stronger. His hands, searching blindly in the abyss, finally closed around a thorny, unassuming plant growing from the rock. He had it. He clawed his way back to the surface, bursting forth with the precious plant clutched in his hand. Elation flooded him. He had not conquered death, but he had stolen a weapon against decay from the god's own garden. He named it, "The Old Man Becomes a Young Man." And in that moment, he believed he had cheated fate. The return journey with Urshanabi was lighter, filled with a new purpose. He would return to Uruk with this prize. He would use the plant himself first to test its power, and then share it with the elders of his city. He pictured a Uruk where wisdom was never lost to age, where strength could be perpetually renewed. It was a different kind of legacy than the one he'd imagined, but a glorious one nonetheless. As they journeyed, they came upon a fresh, cool pool of water. Parched and still aching from his dive, Gilgamesh decided to bathe. He carefully laid the precious plant on the bank and slipped into the refreshing water. It was a moment of carelessness, a single instant of lowered guard, and it was all that was needed. A serpent, drawn by the plant's potent otherworldly scent, slithered from a crevice in the rocks. In one smooth, silent motion, it consumed the plant and immediately began to shed its skin, emerging, renewed, glistening, and young. Gilgamesh watched in horror, frozen in the water, as the serpent slipped away, having stolen the fruit of his impossible labor. The cruelest twist was the visible demonstration of the plant's power. It worked perfectly, just not for him. He had nothing. No secret, no prize, no hope. He sat on the bank and wept with a depth of despair that made his previous grief seem shallow. He was empty-handed at the end of the world. The long, silent walk back to Uruk was a journey not across geography, but through acceptance. The sight of Uruk's magnificent walls rising from the plain was no longer a reminder of a prison, but of a haven. The city was not a place to escape from, but a place to belong to. His people were not subjects to be ruled, but fellow mortals on the same brief, precious journey. The wisdom he brought back was not immortality, but something deeper, the understanding that meaning is not found in evading death, but in how one lives within the time given. He accepted his role, not as a god king, but as a shepherd king, tasked with guiding his people and building a legacy that would outlast his mortal frame. The epic ends where it began with the praise of Uruk's strong walls, the very walls the historical Gilgamesh built. But now, they are not a symbol of a tyrant's ego, but of a mortal king's enduring achievement. He learned that while life is fleeting, what we build with our time, the cities, the laws, the stories, can echo for millennia. The story of Gilgamesh, preserved on clay tablets in Ashurbanipal's library and rediscovered millennia later, is the ultimate proof of that. It's a story that tells us our struggle with mortality, our search for meaning, our value of friendship are not modern concerns. They are the very essence of the human experience, and they connect us across 4,000 years of history to a king who learned the hardest and most beautiful lesson of all, how to be immortal and how to make that matter. So if you've made it this far, you've journeyed with him. You've felt that despair and that hard-won peace. If that meant something to you, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these deep dives into our shared past. Let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there, because finding meaning in a story that's 4 millennia old, that's a connection that just might help you survive anything.